Okay, so let's just get it started because since you guys already have your PowerPoint in front of you, let me just start discussing. I have my PowerPoint here, so I don't think that's going to uh, cause us more trouble than it currently does. So let's go ahead and we're going to start with the slide which says universal and markedness. And regarding universal and markedness, first of all, what I wanted to say is the difference between what unmarked forms and marked forms are. From the slides, what you can find, what do you think is the main difference between a marked form and an unmarked form? Which one do you think would be the easier one to get? Unmarked, right? So unmarked forms usually refers to the skeleton, more of the neutral member of a range of linguistic forms, for example, and marked form refers to something that is added on to the unmarked forms. So the markedness differential hypothesis starts with an explanation of the relative difficulty of language learning based on principles of universal grammar, also known as the markedness theory. So regarding the difference between the two, we can find that the marked member of a pair of a relative term usually refers to the additional, something that is a little bit more difficult, rather than the unmarked form, which is more simple, usually more basic or simpler or more frequently used. On the other hand, the others are more complex and less common and also are somewhat cognitively more demanding to learn. So thinking about this idea of unmarked form and marked form, the reason why we started to look at these understanding was that essentially within one language, there might be unmarked form or marked form within one language or across languages that might in fact add on to the difficulty of language learning. So looking at the examples on the bottom, you might be able to find that there is the present tense that we learn first, which is considered to be the unmarked form. And then afterwards, we learn the marked form, which is the past tense or the future tense, or like the present perfect forms. So thinking about the unmarked form and marked forms, I brought back the textbooks. And what I want you to do is get into small groups of five. No, two, four or five will be fine. Try to get into small groups and to try to go through the textbook and try to think about the order of the organization of the unmarked form and marked forms. What that means is this slide essentially highlights that we usually learn the unmarked form first and then move on to the marked forms, right? You don't start with the most difficult concept as you enter the classroom. You start with the basic class, you move on to intermediate and then advanced. Thinking about that idea, go through the textbook and think about how this idea of unmarked form and marked form, the marked difference hypothesis is in fact reflected in these textbook organization, okay? So you can, for example, if you turn to the main, let's say the contents, it could in fact let you guys know about the flow of which seems to come first before learning the other. You can also compare two textbooks because sometimes they are first grade or moving on to third grade. You can see the difference between which seems to be the more complex one, which is dealt towards the end of the high school year or the middle school years. So let's spend some time doing the discussion for now, and then afterwards we'll do the whole group discussion. So let's talk about the chapters together, textbooks together. You don't have to, you can stay where you are if you that's okay. So let's talk about what you were able to find from your own.
Yeah, we found that the text itself it gets longer as we move to the next chapter, and we even found that there are two different textbooks for grade 1 and second grade. Second grade has more complex grammar, and I guess it shows we move from unmarked to marked.
Unmarked to marked forms. Very good. So you can actually observe that was actually very interesting because you can observe the words, the number of words that are included in these texts. Do you think that since I was also part of textbook making, this is somewhat of an insider information, I would have to say, that the number of the text that you can put into the textbook are limited. So we have to manage how many words that you're going to put into a textbook. So you have to spread it out from grade 1 to grade 3. So that is one of the reasons why we have to list out. And another important thing is you might not have been able to find out about this before, but there are a number of words that words that are also limited. So for the textbooks to be published, they go through a very strict approval process, and you have to write out for chapter 1, which ones are the new vocabulary words. So you have to somewhat balance it out so that it's not like 100 words for chapter 1 and like 5 words for chapter 2. So you have to balance it out. So that is one of the reasons why if you look at the textbooks for grade 1, it might seem very easy because sometimes we have to level out the words. So we have to somewhat make a decision to use like the words that are approved for elementary school students, because those would not be counted as newly marked words. Okay, Tina, do you want to add something?
Okay.
Mhm.
I also on this textbook that this textbook is trying to say something about adding nets or full or something like making new words and something.
Yes.
I think this is the one example of one.
So I think this group over here also found a similar example with the introduction of adverbs, probably, right? Adverbs based on adjectives. And so in this way, we learn the adjectives first, and then afterwards, the adverbs becomes the marked ones with an additional features of like ly or ful, attached prefix, post. So all those would be introduced as marked forms. Very good observation. Good. Anything else? Yes.
At the start of the textbook, there were more dialogues, so there are more current tenses used because it's, I guess, dialogue. But as we go to the end, there are more just article-like text. So
Uh-huh.
there can be used diverse tenses,
Mhm.
past or even future.
Yes. So another thing that you might notice is that in textbook approval stage, they also check whether things that you did not learn is introduced upfront. What that means is they're really cautious about what is being taught first. So what has been taught, so it's talking about the marked forms and unmarked forms. So you have to learn about the unmarked forms first and then the marked forms. Related to tenses, for example, if the textbook starts off with, let's say, future tense or past perfect, and then talk about present tense, then it's probably going to get comment on. So that also is something that I think it's like understood as more of a natural flow of learning. Good point, yes. Anything else that you noted? Theo and then,
I think every textbook has a lot of what's the chapter,
Mhm.
and I think the chapter which is at the later
Mhm.
for the later course, kind of tries to sneak in the some marked thing
Uh-huh.
in the that is learned at the previous
Uh-huh.
stage. So I think as the chapter goes on and on, there are more contents we can learn from the same text. I think. Yeah.
So it seems like implicitly they included the marked forms towards the end of the textbooks, right? Good point too. So it's not something that is explicitly taught, but also it could also be introduced implicitly, as just mentioned. Good. Gina, do you want to ask anything? See, you guys had shared moments there. Okay, good point. So in addition to that, you'd be able to find that for some of you who had 2 textbooks, you were able to compare the flow in a more of a longitudinal way, because usually textbooks are made by the same authors for the whole 3 years. So that's why when we plan out what the organization is going to look like, what the structure is going to look like, we talk about the flow of the chapters, we organize, we pull them up all into like an Excel sheet and what we are going to teach or what we are going to mainly focus on. So we have to make those decisions, and It's actually based on like a frequency almost, like which one seems to be more frequently used amongst students or which ones are supposed to be learned as more of an unmarked form as they move towards their high school years. So we have to also consider that it's not just going to end in the middle school, as these are the middle school textbooks, but it's going to be in a continuation towards the more of a marked form. But so that is one of the reasons why, if you take a look at how these textbooks are organized throughout within one activity, as you guys in the back also mentioned about like moving from adjective to adverbs, but also to between textbook grade, the grades of the level of the students, but also within one chapter, you can also see a lot of variation with this idea. So the whole purpose of this is not purpose, but our understanding related to this particular hypothesis was to understand that learners might in fact have more of a difficulty when they're learning the marked forms. And thinking about marked forms and unmarked forms, it can in fact occur between languages. Can you guys think about your own experience? I think I've been talking about like Korean learners using articles that do not exist. For them, the unmarked form is not using articles. But once they are exposed to English, it might present with an additional difficulty with the marked forms of using articles. So that could be an example. Can you guys think about any other examples similar and like this?
I'm recently learning Spanish,
Mhm.
but we English have be verbs like and, but Spanish be verb splits in two different verbs like ser,
Mhm.
ser, and
You're ready.
estar.
Okay.
And yeah, I think that's one of the examples.
I think we also talked about difficulty last time when we were looking at the levels, right? And when we talked about how when one concept splits into two, that's very, very difficult. So as you just mentioned, I think that's another perfect example of an unmarked language to a marked language where it points it out, it somewhat highlights the difficulty and adds on the complexity because it's mapped on. A lot of people complain about how it's difficult to learn English, and I found an interesting image on a website where it says, I think the title was "When You Find Out or When You In Fact Appreciate English," and it was this image over here. I thought it was so funny. And did someone highlight the difference or our understanding of unmarked forms and marked forms? So when we can, I mean, even the article the is being appreciated in this context because it's all relative in a way. We cannot necessarily say that one is always unmarked form because it's all relative. We need to have an unmarked form in order to have a marked form. So that's how we can understand the difference between the unmarked and marked forms. Okay, so let's now go back to our slides. You can return to your seats where you find it more comfortable. Okay, so now we are going to look at another important model in second language acquisition, which has to do with competition model. So competition model argues that learners can no longer rely on formal cues from the first language, such as phonological or syntactic patterns, to interpret meaning. So they began to search for alternative or competing cues to construct meaning in the second language. What this means is learners cannot rely on familiar cues from that they can find from their first language. For example, when you're learning Korean learners learning Japanese, they might in fact find some of the familiar words like you guys know what kabang is, right? Kabang means bag. So in Japanese, it's also kabang. So from learning Japanese for Korean students, it might be a little bit easier, right? Because you can easily connect. However, they might encounter expressions that they do not necessarily associate it with their first language. In that sense, in that case, they need to find some of this type of complementing cues that they need to find out for themselves. So this is what the competition model refers to, where some languages might rely more heavily on some of the particles rather than other languages, and some learners would rely on syntactic cues, or they might try to learn more about for example, the contextual cues or other cues in order to compensate for the lack of knowledge that they can make connection from their first language. Because first language and second language or foreign language is not identical, right? So therefore, you can bring some knowledge in, but still you have to learn something new from its own context. And that's what the competition model refers to. So this, in fact, this particular model highlights the importance of the input frequency, how much input you get. And also, it also talks about the experiences that students get that in a way that they will gradually strengthen some of the cues that they get from the second language or the foreign language. So moving on to the next one about interlingual or intralingual transfer. I think we talked about this before a midterm. If you guys remember the idea of overgeneralization or the L1 transfer, for example, it has mostly to do with this. When you talk about the main difference between interlingual and intralingual, what do you think is the main difference?
Inter is the relationship of a different two, and
Okay.
intra is the relationship within one.
Yes, very good. So inter has to do with between languages. Intra means within one language. Okay. So that is the reason why we use the expression international relationship, right? Between nations, right? So interlingual also refers to this effect of language forms across two or more languages. I think in the midterm, I saw a lot of you with an example of I very like it, like as an example, where the Korean learners of English might use that as an example of interlingual transfer, where you can find the Korean language structure intervening in the second language and foreign language. Intralingual transfer, on the other hand, talks about the transfer within one language. Which overgeneralization would be an example of that, right? He go to school. So making changes to go from go would be an example of intralingual transfer. So these are some of the things that we already have somewhat touched upon. So let us move forward. But one of the things that I noted was that what is somewhat important is this kind of error that students make in the interlingual transfer or during intralingual transfer shows us a lot about the learner's progress. That was one thing that I wanted to really mention because learners are actively constructing their grammatical rules. And this is something that we talked about last time related to error analysis, right? So through error analysis, we can understand the learner's progress. And that's the same that applies to the interlingual and also intralingual transfer, that we can in fact monitor or capture where these students are. So now we are going to move forward with some of the sources of error in error analysis. So the basic two that we talked about related to transfer has to do with the interlingual errors, where errors are caused by negative transfer or interference from the first language. Another one, intralingual errors like he go to school, errors caused by overgeneralization or developmental processes within the target language. So through these, we can find that some of the overgeneralization or simplification or incomplete rule application could be found. And some of the other examples that those would be some things that we'd be able to find within these interlingual and intralingual errors. Moving on to the next one, which talks about the context. So sometimes the teachers or peers or textbooks or classroom input could influence the students to cause error. And these are sometimes called induced errors because learners subconsciously acquire incorrect forms. So for example, when a student neighbor uses the language form in an incorrect way, but when you're working with a partner, you might just absorb it and be influenced by it, and you both make errors. In those cases, that would be what we call induced errors, where your errors are induced from other people. For example, you might misunderstand a concept or when I introduce to you a grammatical concept and then you apply it differently or apply it in with using overgeneralization, those are all driven by the context. So that's called the context of learning, which might play a role in inducing these errors. Moving on to finally the communication strategies. Learners often, in fact, prioritize communication over accuracy. This is what comes up in communication strategies where errors resulting from strategies learners use to maintain communication. So sometimes when you're in communication, especially when you're trying to, let's say, practice your speaking skill, for example, your main focus rather is on communication, the fluency rather than accuracy, right? So in order for your communication to successfully be done, sometimes accuracy is, let's say, behind your priority of making the communication happen. So that has to do with this idea of the communication strategies where sometimes we talked about code switching, for example, right? Before code switching could be another example of the communication strategies that students use. And through that, we'd be able to monitor some of the errors. So I think we talked about code switching before, and I introduced to you about how people a long time ago looked at code switching as a deficit model, that it talked about the lack of knowledge among students. So it somewhat could be understood in a similar way, that you can find that if a student said, I went to 학교 yesterday, then you might be able to find, oh, this student seems to lack knowledge in the word 학교, so we should teach that student of the word. So it kind of can tell us quite a lot about the student's knowledge status, I would have to say, what the student is missing and what kind of strategies the students, depending on the strategies that the student use, we can learn about where students are at. So these are all sorts of errors that we can understand from the error analysis. But sometimes you might not really necessarily agree, because you might say that, oh, but still, like, we can argue that students can use code switching strategically, not necessarily talk about the errors, right? So those could be confronted too. The foreignizing, for example, is another one, or literal translation. These are quite interesting when you talk about foreign borrowed words, for example. Did I talk about this case before or not? I forgot, but a friend of mine, he went abroad when he was young. This is not my story, by the way. And I think I talked about this, but anyways, he went to kindergarten, but did I tell you? He needed stapler. Did I give that example before? Stapler. Oh, so he needed stapler. And so by the way, he is Korean. And he was like, I think he told me that he was around like 6 or 7 years old. And he needed stapler, so he told he wanted to ask for, can I borrow stapler? But suddenly, so what is stapler in English? And in Korean, we use the expression 호치키스. And 호치키스 sounds very, it doesn't not sound like a regular Korean word. So so he considered, this might be just a foreign word that we use, right? So then he said, he told me that he said, can I borrow hotchkiss? And nobody understood. The same goes with motorbike. In Korea, we use the word otobai, right? And these all come from, by the way, Japanese borrowed words. So he again said, like, oh, I saw many autobikes. He turned it into a plural now, like autobikes, while coming to class. So these are all kind of, when we look at those errors, right, by using the foreign words, for instance, as teachers, we can understand that these are some of the knowledge gaps that the student has and use that as a learning opportunity. Don't you guys have those mistakes yourselves? No? You never make errors, error-free students. I think I had a couple too. So let's just move on. Okay, regarding fossilization. So as you know what fossils are, right? So fossilization essentially has to do with this idea of permanent incorporation of non-standard linguistic forms into a person's L2 competence. It sounds very difficult, but it just means that you produce something wrong and it sticks to you. permanently. That's what fossilization has to do. So fossilization does not necessarily include correct forms. It has to do with something that is incorrect, that stays with you and gets stuck to you. In order to get rid of or remove fossilization, it's very, very difficult. You need to, first of all, become aware of your own error, right? And then afterwards, you have to be paying cautious attention whenever you make those mistakes or errors. However, it is fixable though. So once you are aware of it and pay a lot of attention in fixing it, those are, fossilization does not mean that it is exempt from any possible changes. So it still means that once you are aware of it and when you learn or how put effort in changing it, then it will potentially be fixed. But here in 1970s, we talk about how fossilization could trigger from this balance between affective feedback and cognitive feedback during communication. So both types of feedback can be positive and negative, and these are two different types of feedback that we often talk about. The first one has to do with affective feedback, affective having to do with emotion, okay? And the next one has to do with the cognitive feedback, which talks about the comprehension and production of an utterance. So affective feedback, we say that there are two different types of affective feedback. One is the positive feedback, second, negative feedback. Positive feedback, positive affective feedback, as you can imagine, encourages communication. So it encourages the other person to continue talking. So for example, things like keep talking or I'm listening, for example, or even nodding could be worked as a positive affective feedback. Negative affective feedback means that we are going to terminate communication. So for example, well, I gotta go, right? So things like that means that it is a negative affective feedback. Moving on to the cognitive feedback, this indicates comprehension or of an utterance, where the positive one signals that you understood. For things like or I see, or right. All these would suggest that I understood what you're talking about. So understanding has to do with cognitive, so therefore this is positive cognitive feedback. Negative cognitive feedback signals misunderstanding or lack of communication. So things like what, or say that again, right, or pardon, like all these would refer to the negative cognitive feedback that you did not get. And so therefore, the other person has to put much more effort in communicating or delivering their message. So in general, you can find that usually the positive affective feedback would make the conversation go on and continue, while the negative one would in fact stop the communication. Regarding these feedback, it could work for you in general in your daily life, in daily conversation. When you want to maintain relationship, you can also use these type of different feedback strategically. Right. So that is one of the reasons why when you talk to another person and when you want to express that you're very much engaged, then you continuously nod or like put some fillers in and say like, or ask like additional questions. These are all different type of feedback that we produce. So now we are going to move on to talk about the error treatment. So if you can think about going back through our past how many weeks, like 11 weeks or 10 weeks, we talked about how we have shifted up from around 1970s from this grammar focused instruction, right? And moved on to reduced grammar focus or grammar directed instruction, because we started to understand that that researchers started to believe that learners should naturally learn the language. That was one of the reasons why we had a lot of different methods introduced where the students were encouraged to use language in a very natural way. However, the interesting thing was later on, the later researchers argued that some attention to form was in fact needed. Why? Why do you think some attention to form is needed? This goes back to your own understanding of what the best method of language learning is, in fact. If you had an ideal classroom where you're the student, how would you design the class? If you looked at, since you guys looked at the textbook, you probably have seen in the very beginning in the contents where it talked about it's divided up into like reading, writing, speaking, listening, and grammar, for example. For you, if you could design your own class or your own textbook, how would you design it?
I would also include all of the sections, reading, listening, writing, speaking. I actually really liked how the textbook was organized, which you showed us. It was very fun. And incorporate like implicit and explicit form learning.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay. What do you mean by implicit and explicit forms of learning?
Well, like explicit would be grammar rules, like a grammar box or something. So and implicit would be just introducing those forms in text.
So usually, so when we teach grammar, for example, you can have the grammar pointed out probably towards the end of the chapter that you've seen in the textbooks that you have, but also embed the grammatical rules within the reading text or the speaking, for example. Yes. So what Anel seems to highlight here is that grammar is still included.
Yes.
And why?
Because having some explanation can help to understand the grammar on a deeper level, especially if this type of grammar is not present in your first language.
Mm-hmm. Yes. So the reason why I asked you guys this question was it goes back to the history of language learning, I would have to say. That at the very beginning, we started drilling, right? We started memorizing the patterns, drilling with the ideas. I think some of you might be, in fact, comfortable with memorizing words, for example, or grammatical rules, because it feels like almost like a mathematical question that you apply, right? However, soon afterwards, people found that there seems to be some of the things that we are missing because essentially language learning is related to language using. And in order to use the language in communication, there seems to be the natural data that we are missing. So then people started to move away from grammar, right? Grammar focused learning. And that was one of the reasons why in Korea too, if you track the exams that we had or this curriculum that we had in Korea from the 1980s to current moment, you can in fact find that wave of transformation where people were trying to move away from grammar. The other reasons why is some of your textbooks still does because those were published later before around like 2020 I don't know 2000s or to 2010s I forgot but in those textbooks we started to not call grammar. It uses expressions like language and focus, or some, I don't know what your textbook had, but if you remember that it was not really using the word grammar anymore. It felt like by the way, I did not read Harry Potter till the end, but it felt like Lord Voldemort. Is that right? Because I heard that there was a line in the book, something about his name is not supposed to be spoken, right? So it's like that, like grammar, we can no longer call grammar. So that has to do with a lot of our underlying ideologies about what language learning should be like. But teachers, especially textbook makers, we are always putting grammar in there because there should be a level of forms on focus in order for communication to in fact happen. Otherwise, we talked about last time the local errors and global errors, right? Otherwise, it would be uncomprehendable if the students are just talking without even any knowledge in grammar. So grammar still puts those ideas, put them together and make it sensible or comprehensible. So that's why we started to move away from grammar and then afterwards, people are somewhat coming back to grammar because they are still saying that at least some attention to grammar in language classroom is necessary. So that's related to what we say form-focused instruction. which has to do with any pedagogical effort used to draw learners' attention to language form, either implicitly or explicitly. So NL just met, as you mentioned, you can teach students about this is the present tense and this is what. But you can also find the use of present tenses in the preceding reading activities, reading text, or during the dialogues, and then have them draw their attention to what they learned about. Some of the key psychological processes related to form-focused instruction has to do with these following. For example, you need to be conscious. So you have to have the consciousness and paying attention to what these forms are. So for making from changing from the unmarked form, the present tense to past tense, you have to add ed at the end or d at the end, depending on what comes before. So you have to have that consciousness. In addition to that, you need to be aware of the grammatical rules and the difference between the L1 and L2, for example. You have to have that awareness. Similar to that is attention, where you need to pay focused attention on learning. If you're not really attending to what's being there, you're going to leave the classroom without anything in your mind. The implicit and explicit dichotomy still exists. Some people say that the implicit way works better. Some people argue that explicit way would work better depending on the learner preferences. So those are some of the key psychological processes that people talk about related to the form-focused instruction. Did I miss anything? I think that's it. Okay, so moving on to now talking more about the categories of feedback. So now we are going to talk about different types of feedback and also the responses to feedback. So for the next 2 slides, I believe, talk about different types of feedback. First one is called recast. So try to imagine what kind of feedback you received the most or which one worked for you. Recast is an implicit one. So implicit type of corrective feedback that formulates or expands on ill-formed or incomplete utterances. So what that means is if the learner says, I lost my road, teacher says, oh yeah, I see. You lost your way. And then what happened? So here the teacher does not necessarily point out that it's not road, it's way. Right? So here, without drawing attention to the word road, this teacher just recasts and uses them and in continuation to the next conversation. That is the reason why it says it's unobtrusive. So it does not come in between and draw the student's attention to that particular error. Corrective feedback usually refers to the responses to a learner's output that attempts to repair or draw attention to an error or a mistake. So corrective feedback refers to the correction, right? How you're trying to provide correction of an error or either a mistake. Clarification request. So this is another type of feedback that prompts the learner to reformulate or repeat an utterance because it is unclear or inappropriate. If the learner says, we went to July 4th, fireworks and crackers were very loud, and did you really mean crackers, little biscuits that you eat? So here, by using the word crackers and clarification question, you can highlight that it was somewhat unclear or inappropriate. Metalinguistic. Metalinguistic has to do with this idea of using another language to explain language. So it refers to the responses to a learner's output that provides comments, information, or questions related to the linguistic form of the utterance. So the learner says, I'm here since January. Then the teacher says, well, okay, but remember we talked about the present perfect tense. So present perfect tense becomes the metalinguistic form, referring to that you should not use the present tense, but present perfect tense instead. So pointing that error out using the metalinguistic feedback. So this refers to the comments about the grammar itself. That's how you can understand it. Instead of giving the answers directly, the teacher can provide some of the points from the grammatical knowledge. Moving on to the next one, which talks about the elicitation. So elicitation refers to a corrective technique that prompts learners to self-correct their utterances. So the learner says, what means this word? And the teacher says, Lewis, how do we say that in English? What does? So here you're using this technique that the student can self-correct. So what does this word mean? So the student can continue on with filling what the teacher has started and then completing the sentence. So that's called elicitation. The explicit correction is very explicit. So directly indicating that a learner's form is incorrect and providing the correct form. So when the student says, when I have 12 years old, the teacher says, no, not have. You mean when I was 12 years old. So by stressing what the student has said in error and also highlighting what the student should have said, this is considered to be very explicit correction. Finally, repetition is another one where the teacher simply repeat what the student has said, but usually in a different intonation. So when the student says, when I have 12 years old, the teacher says, when I have 12 years old, and just stops, right? And it raises intonation. And then the student implicitly, again, gets, oh, something seems to be off. What should I change, right? So that's different. So the difference between repetition, however, with recast is a continuation, right? It goes on and it's very vague in a way, but here repetition has to do with just the raising of the tone and repeats what the student has said exactly, but in a different tone usually. Which one do you think seems to be more effective? Recast? Recast? Who do you think might benefit from a lot of this type of feedback?
Maybe some introverted.
Yes. So somebody who is very who does not like to be corrected every single time, for example, right? Or even in classroom where it's more focused on conversation, right? Rather than grammar focused or reading focused classroom, right? In those cases, I think recast could be worked effectively. Anything else that you think would also be effective?
I agree with recast.
Recast, especially in language classrooms.
Yeah.
But one thing that recast could end up is fossilization too. Because sometimes students might not learn that, and sometimes students might in fact say, you lost your way, and what happened? Oh, so what happened was something, something, something. So the students might be unaware of what the student in fact said. So that's one. So if they're really not paying attention to or cautious about what they're talking about, then in those ways, sometimes it could lead to incorrect or the student without any uptake. That's what we are going to talk about. So it has that possibility though, right? So sometimes a very strategic teacher might in fact go back to that topic later on again and really check whether the student have said it correctly or not, or really got whether it should be I lost my way instead of I lost my road. But so it again depends on the teacher's capability there. But if the students immediately said, oh yeah, I lost my way and what happened was blah, 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 then that in fact shows that the recast was successful. So it all somewhat depends on what the responses to these feedback are. So that's where we are going to move on, where we can find that there are usually 3 different types of responses. So first of all, what happens is an uptake. Uptake usually means that the student immediately follows the teacher's feedback and responds in some way to the teacher's attempt to draw attention to what this means was successful. So successful uptake, there's also sometimes a failure uptake because the student still might attempt to, but the production might in fact be incorrect. So uptake does not necessarily means that it was successful, but it shows that at least the student was able to respond to it. So that's an example of what an uptake is. It shows that the student showed an attempt or at least noticed that there was this correction attempt. Repair on the next points to it shows when the learner successfully correct an error. So that's repair usually means it was successful. So for example, in this encounter, one student says, I was in the airport waiting for someone to pick up. And the second student says, you mean someone to pick you up? And the student again says, oh yes, I waited for someone to pick me up. So you can find that the third line where the student was able to self-correct an ill form where it was started off as pick up to pick me up. It shows that there was a successful repair that was made here. So repair usually refers to the successful correction of one speech. So it's called repairing, like repairing your tire, right? Repairing something. Repetition, you guys know what repetition usually means. It is a reiteration by a learner of the correct form following the teacher's feedback, sometimes by incorporating the correct form into a longer utterance. Sometimes it can in fact, get longer. So the learner says, I will be studied in school for 2 years to get degree. Really, someone will study you. So there's a question that says like, oh, are you sure you are being studied? And the learner says, no, I must study for 2 years at UCLA to get an MBA degree. So the learner pretty much repeats and incorporates the corrected forms into a larger utterance. So this is what we call the repetition. So a lot of the times the researchers, we pay attention to which types of responses seems to be more effective for what kind of learners. But not all uptake suggests that it's going to end up as a successful learning. So these are just, let's say, a way to categorize the behavior of the learners, rather than just saying that this is going to guarantee that the student has learned the concept or the term or word or grammatical rules. But these are all considered to be very important steps for language acquisition of the learner to occur. So when you think about going back to a lot of these errors and also the feedback types that we have talked about, sometimes you might argue that this seems to work best, right? But it might work best for you, but not for other people, right? It might work best for this particular context, but not for others. It might work for small group discussion, but not for the whole group. So people, when we talk about this is again not a cookie cutter that we can say that it applies to every single cases for every single student. It's in fact very diverse, and that's where a lot of people, researchers, are paying attention to, like looking at what kind of feedback it seems to be best. Next coming week, we're going to talk about computer-assisted language learning, and we are encountering a very dramatically transforming world nowadays, especially with technology and the AI, right? Think about what kind of feedback AI produces. And I think this is a very important question. Sometimes AIs are very nice. They never do they get angry? Not necessarily, right? So when you think about like your encounter or how you talk with the like AI, for example, you can start thinking about what are some of the feedback types that they produce. And because they might, in fact, when they are going to be used in language learning, you might have to balance some of these out. So I think these are all related to the core idea of personalization when we start talking about how the development of technology is going to provide learners, especially language learners, with personalized learning, and how, right? How so is still not answered. So I think these are some of the very important and interesting ideas that we can continue thinking about towards the end of the semester. Okay, so now I have the last weekly reflection for you guys. This time, we are going to come back to this week's learning of the learner language, interlanguage errors, and corrected feedback. So you can either choose one or the two, as you have been doing. So think about your own language learning experience. Can you remember a time when you made an error repeatedly and experienced fossilization? In your own language, like your L1 or L2, it does not matter. So if you can think about, go back to the use of your own language and find out that this seems to have already fossilized, how I'm trying to fix it, you can talk about them here. What type of corrective feedback do you think is most helpful? I think some of you already have some of them in mind, but try to describe more specifically about going into detail for which type of students because of such and such reasons, right? So again, the maximum of 2 pages, and that's it. So this is going to be the last weekly reflection. Next week, I realized that we don't, hold on. Yes, weekly reflection. That's it then.